Welcome to the Bean Pod, a podcast about decentralized finance and the Beanstalk protocol. I'm your host, Rex. Before we get started, we always want to remind everyone that on this podcast, we are very optimistic about decentralized finance in general and Beanstalk in particular. With that being said, 3 things. First, always do your own research before you invest in anything, especially what we talk about here on the show. Second, while you're doing that research, try to find as many well-developed, opposing viewpoints as possible to get the best overall picture. And third, never ever invest money that you can't afford to lose or at least be without for a while. And with that, on with the show. Those of you familiar with Beanstalk will know that the method by which Bean finds its price and returns to peg is theoretically straightforward. Basically, when demand, and therefore price, is high, Beanstalk produces more beans to meet that demand and lower price. When demand and price are low, Beanstalk increases incentives for participants to reduce the bean supply by lending them to the protocol, which brings the price of bean back up. The instruments that Beanstalk uses for lending are called pods. After they're created, pods, like beans, can be traded, bought, and sold, but Beanstalk didn't originally have a platform to make these transactions happen. Folks began buying and selling pods in the Discord server, but the process was clunky and the risk of fraud was real. In short, pods needed a system for price discovery and market clearance. In response, a small team of our community members developed the pod marketplace. Working alongside our core development team, this group created a platform where users could list the number of pods they were willing to sell, where they were in the pod line, how much they would be willing to sell them for, etc. Potential buyers could search the listings and, if all the pieces fit, snatch the listed pods up. Then from the other side, potential buyers could lay out the terms under which they'd be interested in buying pods, and if a seller saw terms they liked, they could fill the order. The system became popular, especially for people who didn't want to wait until their pods matured. It was also popular with folks who wanted to flip pods, kind of like someone could flip a house, buying it and then reselling it for a profit down the road. The first version of the pod marketplace was a huge success, with millions of dollars in transactions taking place since inception. Version 2, which is slated for release in November, has a particularly exciting feature upgrade, and one of the key V2 developers, known as Malteasy, is with us today. Malteasy, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Rex. Great to be here.
Malteasy, how about you just give us a little bit of your background and how you became aware of Beanstalk and how you got involved with the project and how you got to this point?
Yeah, sure. So I kind of got into the whole crypto scene early last year, like January of last year. And the way I kind of got into crypto was through this new blockchain social media platform called BitClout at the time. I'm not sure if any of you guys have heard of it, but the founder of that platform, who goes by the pseudonym Diamond Hands, was actually also the founder of this algorithmic stablecoin implementation called Basis Protocol. And so I kind of like got interested in the whole like algorithmic stablecoin like area, like very sub area of cryptocurrency, like kind of early on last year after learning about BitClout and learning about the founder of BitClout and his background. But at this point, Beanstalk still didn't exist, obviously. So what I was doing after that was I was basically like running kind of this centralized cryptocurrency exchange where we were the first off ramp essentially for the BitClout platform, and we were off ramping the BitClout native currency, which was called Clout, onto Ethereum. And this project, it started off essentially like as a hackathon project that me and my best friend were working on, and it started off like super well. Like we were getting a ton of liquidity. a ton of like daily transaction volumes, but at that point, like my understanding of like the whole security landscape, because I was like a technical founder and I was pretty much like building all of the back end like myself and having like not a ton of like prior knowledge and experience like building systems like that. I wasn't like aware of all of the vulnerabilities that could be possible, and we got exploited for like a considerable amount of money that we lost. And after that point, we kind of had to wind everything down. And and kind of like I was just beginning to get exposed to the whole crypto landscape as a whole. And around this time was when I learned about Olympus DAO. So you guys have definitely heard about Olympus. Yeah. So I was a 3-3er. I was a Omi back in the day. Yeah. And at that point on, like the concept of DAOs just became super interesting to me. Although I never contributed to Olympus, that was like definitely one of my early exposures to the whole like decentralized autonomous world. And after that point, one of my friends that actually introduced me to Olympus, who was also a fellow Omi, um, kind of like started talking to me about Beanstalk early on, like during September of the same year, and I didn't understand Beanstalk like a crazy amount at first. I was just very amused, I guess, by the bean farm taxonomy. Yeah, but I hadn't like looked into it a ton until probably later on in the year, when I kind of just started to read the white paper and look into the tech that Beanstalk was using. And at this point, I was also like learning Solidity myself. So I was just kind of looking for projects to work on. And I just reached out to Publius and kind of like other members of the Beanstalk community, like Beanjoyer, for example, who was the developer for the smart contracts for the pod marketplace V1. And yeah, Publius and Beanjoyer kind of, really introduced me to the Beanstalk code base, and I got involved in a couple small projects within Beanstalk at that point until we started to like brainstorm about what pod marketplace V2 could look like, kind of near the start of this year, like probably around February. And I'd been just working on Pod Marketplace V2 like independently, mostly independently with a lot of like brainstorming and like ideas back and forth with Beanjoyer and Publius, and they've been like incredibly helpful, especially because I was so I was like definitely a Solidity noob when I started out writing the V2 of the marketplace, and I think I had to go through like 3 or 4 major like rewrites of it throughout the course of this year until we reached the point we are at today.
Love it. And that's great. So something that I want to kind of focus on and make sure to highlight is that this is a community developed project. So Beanstalk has its team of devs that are like kind of that part of that core group, but both V1 and V2, the pod marketplace, are things that members of our community, yourself obviously, and you mentioned Bean Joyer, have said, okay, there's an opportunity here, there's a use case here for this particular set of functions. We think we can take this on. And like you said, working closely with Publius, have made things happen on top of Beanstalk already. I mean, I think of the pod marketplace as the first kind of unique set of additional functionality laid on top of Beanstalk that wasn't from the dev team specifically. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I'm not totally sure if it's the only aspect of the bean farm that was, like, kind of developed by the community, but I know that it was definitely one of those things that was, like, super influenced by, like, how active of a community Beanstalk actually had managed to foster, and I think that's, like, probably one of my favorite parts of being a bean farmer is, like, the crazy community that we have.
Indeed. Yeah, folks that are constantly looking at both the protocol itself, the technical components, the economic and financial components, and then community components, and saying, okay, what can we do to make this better? And you know, part of that is folks that are making suggestions or developing ideas, and then there are other groups of folks now that there's really a growing list of, let's say, somewhat independent contributors, some of whom have become more part of the core team. I think of T-Bic, who really started out just kind of doing independent data analysis, and now has kind of made his way onto the team. And like there are just so many stories of folks that just said, "I believe in this project. I think there's some really good things happening here. Now, what can I do? How can I contribute in a way that makes this move forward or work better?"
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, and I'd say that I was probably one of those people that was, really drawn in by, like, how strong of, like, an ethos that, I think Publius and the community really fostered around Beanstalk and, like, just how, sound, like, the overall, like, vision of Beanstalk as a protocol seemed, um, even if at the time, like, I didn't, like, even before I fully, like, kind of got myself into the Beanstalk, like, culture and, like, the Beanstalk, like, ecosystem, I was already, like, kind of, um, like, you could say impressed by, like, the kind of activity Beanstalk had going on around it, at least in comparison to, like, some other projects or, like, other protocols that I've seen in the past, like, I was really thinking that Beanstalk was one of a kind in a sense.
Yeah, I agree, and I would say having a very different background, but still seeing that similar ethos is really what pulled me in as well. Just saying there are a lot of smart people around here that have very good ideas and that have a genuine desire to see this succeed. I think most folks involved in any project in crypto right now would be lying to themselves if they didn't say that there was some aspect of this that was financial. But at the same time, to have a group of people that say, we see a really interesting way of changing how economic systems work. There may be a better way to do this through this very unique concept of credit based algorithmic stablecoins. I, I feel like that set the stage for a lot of our really most valuable contributors, either formally, through technical contribution or thought contributors or, you know, business development, the wide range, folks that have got involved in the project really see that ethos of Beanstalk.
Yeah, yeah, definitely, and, like, the scope of the problem, that Beanstalk is, like, trying to solve, like, creating a completely decentralized stablecoin, like, that in itself is, like, really huge to me at least because, like, it's a pretty ambitious goal, like, very ambitious goal, I should say, of, like, creating a better monetary system, like, in general for, like, the whole world, like, having something that's resistant to not just centralized control, but also, like, all the bad things that come with it, like hyperinflation, like, creating something that's, like, more stable, more robust than the current monetary system. I think that ambitious goal that Beanstalk has as a stable coin is kind of what makes me always like very excited to not just be part of the community, but like to work on Beanstalk and like think about problems within Beanstalk. And I'm sure it's a big factor for a lot of people.
Indeed. So, to kind of set the stage for our conversation, how would you just talk to us a little bit about just the pod marketplace itself? Like, what is it? Why is it important? What specific function does it offer to people that are participating in Beanstalk?
Yeah, so the pod marketplace right now is basically a decentralized way to exchange pods, which, as we all know, is the native debt asset that Beanstalk has. And the reason that pod that the pod marketplace was introduced is kind of to facilitate like more liquidity around pods and to find like a better process for price discovery around the debt asset. Um, and we felt like it was a pretty important step in the evolution of Beanstalk as a protocol to bring as much utility as we could around pods. And pod marketplace is definitely something that adds a lot of utility and added benefit to pods aside from just being the native debt asset.
So, I feel like the pod marketplace is almost a formalization in certain ways of things that were happening like in Discord and through DMs. Like people were starting, as Beanstalk started to ramp up and the pod line started to grow, it seemed like folks were reaching out to each other saying, hey, I've got 20,000 pods at this space in line. Is anybody interested in buying them? And it seems like the pod marketplace was a way to start to formalize that, correct?
Yeah, essentially. So now basically instead of, requiring like some sort of party that you have to trust in order to proceed with your exchange of pods, you can just do it in a trustless way through the pod marketplace. So it's a great benefit.
And now, I mean, as the pod marketplace has evolved, I mean, I feel like the real early versions were very simple. It's essentially just a listing service, and then eventually um, the UI started to get built out, and we started to see the the graph screen get built to offer some visualization. And as that's happening, more transactions are happening as well, and people are starting to utilize the service. The It seems like now we're in a place where individuals have the ability to do a couple functions. They can list pods that they're interested in selling. You can also list a desire to purchase, correct?
Yeah, exactly. So right now you can actually create pod listings. So that's essentially when you want to sell a plot that you own for a certain price, and you can also specify a minimum place in line that the pod listing will sell at. So if, for example, you have a listing at 10 million place in line, and you don't want that listing to be active anymore after it gets to let's say 9 million, the listing will just expire. It will become essentially inactive after that point. And there's also pod orders where you can create essentially a bid to ask for pods at a specific price point. I should note that this is the main limitation with the pod marketplace right now is that the price that you set your listings to sell at and the price that you set your orders to buy at is a static single price for the entirety of the pod line, which is kind of a limitation because um, because the pod line is something that kind of carries value with it at carries a different value at different places in the pod line. You ideally want to have a way of specifying a variety or a set of prices that you would buy at, for example, for a pod order. rather than a single static price.
Yeah, so if I've got pods that I'm looking to sell, I know that as the pod line continues to churn, the theoretical value of those pods changes. They theoretically become worth more as they get closer to the front of the line. And so what you're saying is there's functionality around trying to manage this problem of the change in value of pods over time, right?
Yeah, exactly. So if you had a pod listing that was statically priced and it moved up in the pod line, you'd ideally, as you said, you'd want to change the value of those pods, and you'd want that to be reflected in the pod listing. So to do that right now, you basically have to first of all cancel the pod listing and then create a new one, which is just two on-chain transactions that carry with it gas costs of the Ethereum network and the friction of actually having to do those actions, and that's kind of like the main friction, the main point of friction that we wanted to address in respect to pod listings. And for pod orders, it's slightly different because you're essentially asking to buy pods from like a whole range. Like you can specify the maximum place in line which your pod order is willing to buy pods at, and you can also specify a single price per pod for that entire pod range. Now, let's say you wanted to buy pods at a multitude of different places in line across the pod line, and let's say you wanted to assign a different value to each of those places in the pod line. You'd essentially have to create a set of orders, like a multitude of orders, and you'd have to lock in beans into each of those individual orders, um, which is, I would say, like an even bigger point of friction because you're essentially locking away liquidity and having to, create more than a single transactions to do what should essentially be done in a single transaction.
Gotcha. So now managing that, is that part of V2 or is that a function of version 1?
Yeah, so in V2, what we're proposing is essentially making the price per pod um, as a function of the place in the pod line that that individual pod is at. Um, so if you were to create a bid, so if you're trying to create a pod order, you could essentially define a curve, so a pricing curve that um, you'd pay um, so the order would pay for pods according to what the price is defined to be at the place in line that the order is being filled at according to the pricing curve. Yeah,
Yeah, so as the place as the pods move in line, theoretically they would change the value of that pod's value would change in conjunction with its place in line along the curve, correct?
exactly. Yes.
All right. So it's a more dynamic pricing function with a little bit greater let's say more precise control by the seller or buyer.
Yeah, exactly. And you can also actually make it as precise or as general as you please because the way we're implementing these pricing functions is through piecewise polynomials. Um, and you can basically have unlimited or an infinite amount of pieces in the polynomial pricing function that you define. Um, and this is kind of like a kind of odd topic, but you can actually use like piecewise polynomials to approximate like any type of function in general. So having like a theoretically unlimited amount of pieces that you can describe the polynomial in is pretty powerful in my opinion because you can almost have an infinitely customizable pricing function, and you're not really limited um, because of the fact that it's only polynomial.
So, from a user standpoint, how does that? And I don't want to get too far because I know that everything's still under development. Like, how would that work out for me? I'm, let's say, a mid-level user, feel pretty comfortable with the pod marketplace. This enhanced functionality, I mean, is it something that you said I could have as fine tune a control or as general control as I want? How does that work out from a functionality standpoint?
Yeah, so what we're kind of thinking about right now, this is still in the works, as you said, but essentially what I'm imagining it to look like is you're going to be able to define a set of data points, and these data points would basically correlate to the amount of beans you're willing to pay per pod. So the bean denominated value per pod at specific places in the line. And on the front end, we'd essentially have an algorithm running, something called like piecewise polynomial cubic Hermite splines. So it's like a kind of complicated um, computer graphics algorithm that we would use to essentially interpolate all these different data points that you enter and create like a smooth pricing curve based on the points that you enter. And this would only be like an option. Obviously, you'd be able to manually enter the polynomial that you'd want to use for your pricing function as well. But this was something that um, we thought would be a cool way to implement it on the UI front. And a way to visualize this would be kind of, I don't know if you've ever seen like the color balance curves on like Photoshop or other like photo editing software where you can like kind of like move the curve up and down and like add new points to change like the different color levels in the picture. Uh, but yeah, that kind of an interpolation of those different data points is like what the p-chip algorithm actually looks like.
That's really interesting. It sounds like it will provide optionality for a wide range of users. I know that. I mean, again, when I think of myself, I'm familiar with the functionality, know the goals of the pod marketplace, but like that level of precision is beyond something that I would use. But it's really exciting to hear that like folks that will have really high level analysis that they'll be trying to utilize, or really specific goals they'll be trying to meet will have that fine tuned capability.
Yeah, definitely, and that's one of the reasons why it was, like, super exciting for me, to work on this project as well. Like, I'm, as you would say, like, a pretty mid-level user, yeah, pretty familiar with the pod marketplace, and kind of it's very clear to me, like, how adding pricing curves, would definitely help my use case, but maybe I'm not the user that would take necessarily full advantage of all the functionality that it actually provides, and so I'm just really excited to see, like, um, what kind of, like, really complex analysis people can do to actually create, like, these pricing curves that have essentially, like, um, infinite possibilities.
So when it comes to V2, how would you just give us an overview of some of the main components? You've talked about the pricing curve a little bit. Uh, uh, Give us more of a broad picture, if you would.
Yeah, so V2 is actually it's going to be very similar to V1, except the change that we're making is the addition of dynamic pricing. So this is actually like completely irrespective of the UI changes. I'm not able to say like exactly what it's going to look like, but at least for the component that I've been working on, um, the main change that we've made is that price per pod for pod orders and pod listings is no longer static, and instead it's been made into a function of the place in the pod line. Um, so I can just quickly go over how pod orders and pod listings will work. So yeah, so when a V2 listing is filled, the price per pod will basically be calculated dynamically as a function of the place in line at the start of the listing. So people will essentially no longer have to cancel and relist their listings if they want to update the price, because the price will already be defined at all of the different places in line that that plot could potentially be at on the pricing curve. And when that listing gets filled, it'll just be calculated as a function of that place in line. It works slightly differently for orders. So if you're creating an order, basically asking, or no, creating a bid for pods, um, the price per pod that that order pays for is actually calculated as is as by an integration, essentially, of the price function from the place in line of the start of the fill to the end of the fill. So that is each infinitesimally small pod that that order is filling for will have a unique price associated with it according to the pricing curve, and the order will basically fill for the sum of the value of all of those pods.
So, with the pod marketplace V2 starting to come to fruition, first of all, could you kind of give us just a little bit of information about where that is in terms of its development, and then what you're seeing out in the future?
Yeah, for sure. So we gave the smart contracts to Halborn a couple weeks ago, and they've been working on getting that all audited. Hopefully, that'll be ready for BIP 28 in probably around a month or so. But I can't say exactly when it'll be ready because it's obviously pretty dependent on the state of what the front end looks like. So it might take a little bit longer, maybe closer to 2 months, but it um, is definitely coming upon us soon.
That's great. And then what do you see further out? I mean, are there any other projects that you're looking at or problems that you're looking to potentially tackle in the future?
Yeah, so I was actually like kind of interested in on-chain governance for a little bit ever since I guess Beanstalk got exploited because of our on-chain governance. Um, I haven't been looking into it too much recently, but if there was something I would be interested in working on, like that would be the first thing that comes to my head. Um, just exploring like a new strategy for on-chain governance for Beanstalk moving forward.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, I know that's been a part of a lot of conversations, really since the exploit is does it make sense to looking at how we manage governance, taking governance off chain. I know was a painful thing, for the core team, and there's a desire to get that back on chain as soon as possible. So it sounds like a fascinating problem to address.
Yeah, definitely. And it's something that I think is really important because the whole ethos of, decentralization is pretty contingent on on-chain governance.
Yeah, I completely agreed. So as a user, if I'm looking to put up listings or buy pods on the marketplace for V2. So, how does that improve functionality change my general experience?
Yeah, so now if you're a person who's gonna go out and make a bid for pods, instead of having to potentially create a bunch of different pod orders for various prices, you can just go ahead, create a single order and it'll be able to cover a pricing curve that covers the entire range of pods that you're willing to buy from. And the way that you can define this pricing curve um, is quite simple in essence. You can just create a small data set of price points. So, for example, like let's say you have a price point that says at 10 million place in line, you're willing to buy pods for like zero point 0.5 BDV. And let's say at 50 million place in line, you're willing to buy pods at zero point 0.4 BDV. And then at 100 million, it's at zero point 0.3 BDV. So you'd basically be able to enter in a set of different price points like that. And our UI would essentially generate a function that interpolates all of those different prices to um, get like a satisfactory pricing curve. And this would be like customizable to some degree, like whether if you wanted to interpolate it using like cubic polynomials or just linear functions, or if you have a completely different interpolation algorithm you want to use, you could do that as well. And then you'd basically be able to create that pricing function and upload your pricing function as part of your order or listing. And it just makes the entire process of finding the correct price for pods at each place in line like far easier, because if you think about it now, each pod order or each pod listing is defining like prices for a huge range of pods rather than just a single price and a single like place in line. So now you have access to a ton of data to like look across and kind of compare your pricing curve to other people's pricing curves, and like even just like sell into an order that already exists and like sell into a pricing curve that looks most appealing to you. And overall, the friction of the pod marketplace would hopefully just be significantly reduced and essentially aid in like the price discovery of pods as an asset.
So if I was looking to create an order and said, well, I'm willing to buy a certain number of pods at a particular BDV, through this more complex system, I would be able to establish those requirements for filling my order in a more precise way. And it would create essentially like finish lines for a set of pods to cross. Am I understanding that correctly? So like as a particular set of pods is available on the marketplace and it moves through a pricing curve towards being harvested, is this would this functionality allow those two, that order bandwidth or that set of order parameters to converge with the dynamic curve along which a set of pods moves?
Yeah, yeah. Actually, that's really exciting to think about, and you're absolutely right. Like you could have listing and order curves that like converge with each other and kind of just like fill with each other like automatically. Like as a listing might move into the acceptable um, place in line that the order is willing to buy from, and if the pricing curve of that listing aligns with the pricing curve of that order, then that's a scenario where like you could just complete that exchange.
Man, I'm glad you understood what I was saying because it made sense in my head, but I'm thinking, oh my gosh, there's a chance that I could say this and it could be like, yeah, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But good, that's because that's exactly what went through my mind. I am very much I prefer those like set it and forget it
Yeah, yeah,
scenarios, and like this, that's what as you explain this functionality to me, that's what goes through my mind is like if I've got a really good understanding of, yeah, an acceptable band for BDV or whatever that order might be, and I've got a good understanding of what pricing curves will move through that acceptable space and how long it may take, that is extremely valuable.
Yeah, definitely. Like, I'm not exactly sure how the auto clearing might work, but in ideally there would even be something that would like kind of auto clear all the orders and listings in the market that would like line up with each other. Because right now, like the process is that like a user needs to go in and manually fill the orders or listings. But maybe there's also um, kind of an optimization for that you could build where it just kind of auto clears. I'm not totally sure, but yeah,
Hey, maybe that's V3. You never know.
yeah, maybe or 4T 2.1. We'll see.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Well, this has been great. I mean, really, like I really appreciate your time. I appreciate you talking through this. Um, I've learned a ton, as I usually do. Thank you for joining us, Malteasy.
Yeah, of course, no problem. It was great being here, man.
You can find Malteasy in the Beanstalk Discord and version 2 of the Pod Marketplace when it hits the Beanstalk site in November. The Bean Pod is a production of Beanstalk Farms, a decentralized autonomous organization. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, Medium, Discord, and our home on the web at bean.money. You can also find me on Twitter at RexTheBean. And as a final reminder, this podcast is not financial advice.